Okay, we're starting now. Good morning, everyone.
Hi.
If you are here, Taro, you can start just with the presentation of the meeting now. Si puedes escucharme, Taro.
Sí, bueno, voy a comenzar con la... Ahí está transmitiendo.
Sí.
Saludos para todos los que van a ver este video, están viendo en vivo. Welcome, Paul. Hoy ya vamos a iniciar con un tema y, digamos, importante en tiempos de la inteligencia artificial, de las crisis económicas y del surgimiento o digamos de la extensión de la actividad del nacionalismo económico. Vemos con Donald Trump las crisis en Japón, en Corea del Sur, el desarrollo tecnológico en China y sobre todo esta nueva etapa económica que estamos viendo aquí en Latinoamérica. En el caso de Argentina, Milei, el nuevo avance de China con los puertos automatizados en Shanghái y el nuevo desarrollo que vendrá en estos tiempos del capitalismo global. En esta ocasión tenemos a Paul Cockshott. Él es matemático y economista, a la par que también investigador en ciencias de la computación. Bueno, no voy más y damos inicio al conversatorio con el profesor Paul. Gracias.
Un detallito que quiero indicar en español, un momento, antes de empezar. We will start, Paul, but just let me say one thing in Spanish before. Las preguntas que puedan dar, que estén interesados en colocar o en decirle a Paul, pueden escribirlas en el chat, tanto el privado como si no tienen ningún inconveniente en los comentarios, ¿no? En los chats públicos. Eso sería para todos. Okay. So, we will start now, Paul.
Okay, yeah.
It could be nice if you can just tell us, everyone. We will broadcast, but also after this we will keep the video of this conversation to share some ideas of your work and some ideas.
Okay.
We will discuss now to a wider public after this meeting now. It could be nice if you told us about your career, your life, your biography,
Okay.
And tell us how you came to the Marxist theory and how do you get this work, or you start, or you make this work about the economic planification, the economic.
Okay, I mean, I started off as having, gosh, the echo is unbearable.
There's some echo.
There is terrible echo.
Okay, just wait a minute. Now you can hear me better.
Well, let's see if there's echo when I speak. No, there's no echo now.
Okay.
What I was going to say is that I became politically aware because of my stepfather, who was a social democratic politician.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the Labour Party, so I was out doing canvassing for the Labour Party at the age of about 12 or so, and we paid great attention to all elections and things like that. And also I know from childhood we paid great attention to economic policy issues. When I went to university in Canada initially, and immediately joined the local left student group, which in those days was influenced by the politics of American students and the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and things like that. They're also influenced by the American Progressive Labour Party and its Canadian equivalent, the Canadian Party of Labour. I think later on one would go and say these people became Hoxerists or something like that. But at that stage, it wasn't. They were clearly sort of pro-Chinese, but not. You couldn't say more than that. So I was radicalized, I would say, by that, and took part at the age of 17 or so in organizing an occupation of the university over the conditions that both the quality of the food and the conditions of employment of the canteen workers. At that stage, I was doing a science degree, but being involved in politics made me want to learn economics. So I dropped that and switched to doing an economics degree. And I went to study in Manchester University in Britain. And there I was involved in organizing Marxist study groups, which were under the leadership of the Althusserian journal Theoretical Practice, who had developed an extremely detailed study program in basic Marxism, Leninism, sort of starting with the works of Marx, masses of the works of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, etc. These were basically political works that we studied. The second year I was there, or towards the end of that year, I read Capital, and we organized a study group on Capital for the next 2 years, doing the first, second, and third volumes, and started publishing a local left journal, which just in Manchester. After that, let's see, there's a lot of time to go over. Basically,
okay,
I became involved in couldn't get jobs in as an economist, so I worked in the computer industry and got a computing degree. And when doing computing research, I met up with a Chinese student who'd come over. And at that stage, it was obviously unusual for the Chinese student to find one of his fellow students was a communist. And he suggested that I should go over to China and help them in the computerization of their planning ministry. And I thought that's an interesting problem. So I started thinking about that. And as it turned out, he found that they weren't accepting foreign experts in the planning industry. So that never happened. But it meant that for 2 or 3 years, I started working on how do you design a supercomputer architecture that is capable of planning an economy the size of China. And basically what I hit upon was that you needed machines of very large address spaces. You need 128-bit address space so that you could unify the data in all the machines across China in a single China-wide and later worldwide virtual address space. And I managed to persuade the main British computer company, ICL, that this should be investigated. I also got Acorn, who spun off ARM, to say that, to agree that this should be investigated, and both of them got agreed for me to develop prototype computers to do this kind of thing. The only one that was completed and working was a prototype for our Acorn, which was a 64-bit address machine. And then I was working in a startup company on a 128-bit address machine. I got most of the circuits working, designed, but we never built the prototype because the company collapsed in the 1989 stock market crash. So I then got an academic job. I was no longer working in engineering, and started to look at the way the crisis in the USSR under Gorbachev could be solved. And it struck me that it would be catastrophic to solve it by reverting to the market. And therefore, we had to write a book which would explain how computer technology could solve it and get that book published in Russia. So I was working with my friend Alan Cottrell to write the book, and he went and got a job in the USSR in Moscow, hoping to be able to get it published there. So unfortunately, he found that the economics profession in the university in Moscow he was at, it wasn't Moscow State University, it was another one, was so dominated by Western ideas that no one was the least bit interested in a book on how to improve planning. And it wasn't until just before he left that he met people from Moscow State University, who I suspect may have been I can't remember his name now, who were pro-planning. But anyway, we didn't get it published. And by the time we were in a position to try and get it published I went to Hungary as well to see if I could get it published there. By the time we were in a position to try and get it published, the Berlin Wall had come down, East Germany and Hungary had collapsed from the point of view of Soviet economy, and even the British publishers, New Left Books, said they didn't want to publish a book on planning because it was no longer fitted with their commercial plans. Obviously, they'd adapted their commercial plans to the political circumstances. And we eventually got the stuff published through the Institute of Workers' Control, which was really an offshoot from the Bertrand Russell Foundation. So the Bertrand Russell Foundation published it. Then it was effectively ignored during the 90s until we put it online sometime at the end of the 90s. And then suddenly people in other countries started to take an interest in it and start to translate it. And it then became evident that even if the English-speaking world wasn't interested in it, people in other countries were, and it was worth putting more effort into defending the ideas in it. So we produced classical econophysics as a defense of the basic principles of Marxist economics, which we hadn't felt we had to do initially, but we felt we had to do it after we encountered some of the opposition from East European economists who'd become pro-capitalist that we met, who were saying, oh, it's the naturalistic fallacy to think labor is important, etc. So we felt we had to establish that the labor theory of value was an accurate scientific theory. And to do that, we started doing empirical work on capitalist economies to show that the labor theory of value actually predicted very well the price structure of these economies. And therefore, it wasn't unrealistic to employ this when thinking of a socialist economy.
Nice. biography you told us. I could start with some questions about some things that you said on your on the reconstruction of your past.
Yeah.
What's exactly naturalistic fantasy that some critics told you? What does mean? I don't know.
What they basically were saying is the idea that an economic phenomenon like value can be derived from labor, they say, is naturalistic because it's trying to see a substance for it, which is something in nature, okay? And they said it's no more sensible than an electricity or an oil theory of value. You could have any of these. So what we want to show was that, in fact, if you look at the price structure of a capitalist economy, these other natural units don't work. They give a very poor prediction of the price structure, whereas labor gives an excellent prediction of the price structure.
Okay.
So labor is different. And basically it's different because society is about human beings.
That's in few words what will you tell us about that critics that told you for naturalistic fantasy. Labor theory is exactly the theory of Marx, or what do you mean?
Well, he was a follower of the labor theory of value, okay. But it didn't originate with him. It's worth reading a book by a guy called Meek, who was the editor of Ricardo's works, and he was a Marxist economist, tracing the origins of the labor theory of value. He sees some origin of it in the Catholic theory of just price in the Middle Ages. And then he sees a whole lot of early economists who followed it. And Marx was therefore following in a well-established tradition. It's later been pointed out to me when we published Classical Econophysics that a more plausible origin of it is the Arabic historian Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun.
Yeah. And that he had arguably the first labor theory of value. And if you read Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, there seem to be an awful lot of echoes of Khaldun in his writings. And it makes you wonder whether, although Khaldun was not officially translated from the Arabic until the 19th century, whether Smith had access to it, maybe through some other translation.
It's a speculation, but yes. But I wrote some day in the past that Ibn Khaldun was just the first theorist about the labor theory. Okay. We have some questions from Taro to tell you now, and he was just, writing those questions.
Okay.
One of them, there is two questions I will hear. One of them is the first. How is related the algorithmic thing, the difficulty of the algorithmics in the national planification with the contradictions signed by Marx about the transition from maybe capitalist economy to socialistic planned economy. How the algorithmic thing work there?
Well, I don't think you can say that there is any particular connection, because there is no real discussion of the problems of transition in Marx. There are a few asides, and that's as much as it goes. The questions didn't get seriously addressed till they became practical questions in the 1920s. So, and the algorithmic solution to it comes about by a couple of stages. One is the practical work of constructing economic tables for the Soviet Union, which I think, I've never seen them. Keynes in the early 30s writes that he's received copies of them and they're very interesting. I'm not sure who he got them from. We know that Leontiev was involved in preparing these. So one strand of it is the work of Leontiev, who was a Menshevik, not a Bolshevik. And he left to go to America sometime in the 20s, and continued his work there. But that provides one set of algorithmic solutions which feed back into the Soviet debate in the 1950s. The other is Kantorovich's optimization procedures, which were conceived of as a way of getting an individual factory to get the best output it could with the means of production that it had been provided with and the labor it had been provided with, and were applied successfully in the plywood industry and in the locomotive manufacturing industry and various other industries like that. And then in the 50s, he sees this as a way of optimizing the whole economy. So there's a whole bunch of Soviet authors working on this in the 50s. Now, in the West, the problems of socialist economy are initially addressed by critics of socialism from the right. The most prominent afterwards being Mises and then Hayek. But they were responding to practical things. They were responding to the fact that in Austria, the Social Democrats were almost taking over, and that they had to respond ideologically to the advance of the working class movement. So they produced these claims about the impossibility of socialist planning. And if my understanding is right, these Austrian economists have some influence still in Latin America.
Yes.
Now, there was some response to this in the West, but it wasn't, the Western communists didn't take it very seriously. They didn't. The only people who really wrote a detailed rebuttal or scheme were the Dutch left communists. And I used to have on my website an English translation of the thing they wrote. And what it's proposing is very similar to what we propose towards the New Socialism. We hadn't seen that at the time we wrote. It was only available in German at that time. So although in retrospect you can see that Kantorovich is providing a solution to the problems that Mises and Hayek claim to be pointing out, he wasn't concerned with arguing with Mises and Hayek. He was in a secure position in a society that accepted that socialism was okay, and that's what they were doing. So he was concerned about it in a practical sense. The problem was that then when you get a political crisis, as you did at the end of the 80s, the Soviet economists failed to mobilize the achievements of their own previous generations in the arguments against Western economists. And I think this is related to something to do with the general class position of the intelligentsia in the late Soviet Union and their alienation from the working class that existed to a fair extent among a certain section of them. This is impressionistic based on my memories of the culture of that class who I came in contact with to some extent visiting Eastern Europe in the 80s. Whereas in Britain, we were facing neoliberalism from Thatcher, and therefore if we were on the left at all, we had a greater incentive to find ways to combat that. Now, there was some stuff being done in the Soviet Union to combat it, but somehow it didn't get wide dissemination.
And can you tell us exactly how an algorithm works on maybe in a general planification system? And what are the advantages of it?
Just one moment. Let me go and get something.
Okay. Estamos esperando un momento al compañero Paul. Estamos aquí conversando sobre temas de planificación económica, algunos datos que nos ha indicado sobre...
I don't know whether this shows. No.
No.
I'll have to switch off the screen's background.
Yes, you got that screen background.
How do I do that? Virtual background, disable.
Okay.
Oh,
economic planning.
Are you seeing it in mirror image?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can write it well. I don't know if it in the broadcasting on Colectivo Dignidad is right mirror, but economic planning in the age of climate crisis.
Yes, that is a book by myself, Alan Cottrell, and a physicist, which came out about 2 or 3 years ago, in which we set out in detail the different algorithmic approaches you can use.
Okay.
For planning. And we wrote that because we felt the stuff in Towards a New Socialism was too general and didn't go into the actual known techniques well enough. So I would, if you want to learn about it, I would say start on that book.
Okay.
Basically what we're saying is that there are two big approaches. The approaches of Leontiev and the approaches of Kantorovich. And for a lot of macroeconomic planning the whole economy, the approach of Leontiev is probably the simplest one to take. The approach of Kantorovich can, in principle, give you a more optimal result, particularly in the case where you've got natural resource constraints. Whereas Leontiev style planning is very like, are you familiar with Sraffian theory? The theory of Piero Sraffa, the Italian economist?
I didn't read this Italian economist, but maybe later.
Okay. I mean, Sraffa and Leontiev approach are very similar. If you were familiar with Sraffa, it would tell you something about Leontiev, but if you're not, okay, basically, they don't consider natural resource constraints. Normally, they assume everything is reproducible. So Sraffa's book is The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. Everything is reproducible by labor. Yeah, the neo-Ricardian Piero Sraffa. That is the same approach that's in Leontiev. Kantorovich is dealing with a different situation where you had to face up to the fact that although in principle, he says, everything can be reproduced by labor, in practice, in a rapidly developing economy like the Soviet Union, you have to face up to the fact that you have limitations of the stock of means of production. Although the means of production can in principle be produced by labor, we've only got so many tractors this year. We've only got so many blast furnaces this year. And what we can do is limited by the number of tractors and blast furnaces we've actually got. So he's much more dealing with the not an ideal economy with everything being freely reproducible. He's dealing with an economy that is rapidly industrializing and has to make the best use of limited machine tools, limited let's say oil wells, what have you. And for a developing economy, that may be better. I don't know. The input-output analysis basis was probably pretty good for the Soviet economy in the 1950s. It wouldn't have been so good for the Soviet economy in the 1930s, where physical constraints were much more pressing because the production of means of production was not yet well developed. Now, the problem with all of these ones, as they stand in the literature, is that they don't, or at least as they're taught at Western schools, I don't know what was taught in the USSR, is that they don't tell you how to plan over a long period. They're sort of snapshot pictures. How would we like the economy to be at a given year? They don't necessarily tell you how to get from 2025 to 2035 and the intermediate steps. So what we do here is we go from, presenting the stuff in terms of matrices to presenting it in terms of tensors, in terms of 3 dimensions, 3-dimensional structures, and show that by doing that, you can handle the multi-year problem.
Those constraints you told us have to be with or something to do with demand from the people sector, I don't know how to say it.
I mean, that is not the constraints. That is the optimization criterion. Okay, you aim to optimize something subject to constraints. Now, the constraints you've got are the population, the land area, the existing stock of means of production, for example. What you want to optimize, according to Kantorovich, is over-fulfillment of the plan. Okay? You have a set of plan targets and you want to over-fulfill it. And those plan targets will include the set of consumer goods that are necessary for a growing population. the provision of more houses, the provision of clothing, the provision of increased food supply. All these enter in as the objectives that you're trying to maximize. And there's a difference between Kantorovich style optimization and Western optimization. Western optimization is always in terms of making the most money. Kantorovich is in terms of overfulfilling a plan defined in delivery of material goods.
That's the main difference. It's what to sell.
Well, they use the same algorithmic techniques, but if you look at the way it's taught in the West, where the same techniques were independently invented by Danzig, it is in terms of minimizing cost, for example, or maximizing profit.
Maximizing profit.
In the Kantorovich literature, it's how can the factory maximize its plan fulfillment, where it has to deliver goods in a certain ratio. How can it maximize its output of these?
The planification from we could say the state or the government, we could say something like that. No? The next question we have here is what structural changes could be necessary for the I don't know how to say it, ASPR.
Don't know what that is.
Yes, I don't know. I will ask Taro to fulfill its maximum potential in the Soviet system. I will ask Taro. Taro, ¿tú estás ahí? ¿Estás ahí, Taro? Sí.
Sí, dime. Ok.
Sí, ¿qué es ASPR? En tu segunda pregunta.
ACP, o sea, pregunta, el profesor ya sabe.
No, me dice que no sabe.
Automatic es, lo leí en uno de sus textos.
Pero me dice que no. ¿Automatic qué?
Automatic System Planification, pues, lo he leído, está en uno de sus textos.
Paul, it could be something like automatic standard planification or system planification for ASPR. You know?
I suspect these are some initials.
Yes.
Taken from something in Russia, which have then been translated into other scripts. And I don't know exactly what the system in Russia that was being referred to by that is. So I can't really compare with it.
Well,
I know in general what they were doing, but I don't know the details
of
the techniques they used. And that is the kind of thing that is lost unless some people in the Soviet Union can go and talk to some of the older engineers who did it.
In general explanation, how can understand what is an ASPR?
I don't know what I'm saying. It was I think you're referring to a plan or scheme in the 1960s and 70s that the Soviets had to introduce computerized economic planning. I have read a little bit about it. The problem is part of it I've come across from a novel. There's a novel called Red Plenty, which is about that.
It's not. They are not accurate studies. Just a novel.
Well, it's a historical novel about the people who are building it, about Kantorovich and other people.
Kantorovich. It could be nice to Yes.
It's semi-fictional, so you don't know how much of it is true.
How much is true? How much is just maybe fantasy? I don't know how to say it. Yes, some of our guests here, Javier. Maybe he's Javier. Eres de Chile, ¿no? Me parece. He's asking something related to Dipankar Basu.
I have never read Dipankar Basu.
He said it would be interesting to know if Paul knows.
No, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you can tell us about some another authors you have read.
I mean, just a moment. Get another book.
Another book. Okay. Nos va a traer otro libro sobre otras investigaciones o otros autores que está viendo.
Hey.
Uh-huh.
Ahí para traducirlo.
Para traducirlo también. Okay. We're here now. Yes.
I mean, the reading we've been doing recently was for writing this book, Defending Materialism.
Materialism. Mm-hmm.
Which has just come out. So the stuff on economic planning and labor theory of value is really going back mainly to stuff that we did in the 90s. We went back to it to write the thing on this because we were invited to write the book. In the end, the contract with the publisher fell through, but that was because someone said, could you write a book about it? I think it was the sublation socialist people. We then ran into all sorts of difficulties because they didn't like our typesetting of the maths and things like that, so it fell through. But we've been trying to do a defense of materialism since then, and therefore the stuff I've been reading was much more on the development of classical physics. So I've been reading Newton and Hamilton and people like that, and reading Boltzmann and Einstein, and so I've been concerned with how do you defend materialism from the standpoint of the development of physics from the 17th century on. So I haven't been studying more economics.
It could be more accurate to defend materialism from the economy studies better of the 20th century, 21st century, or from the physics of the 17th century.
Part of what we're doing is contrasting ourselves with the Neumarktslektur people, the neo-Hegelians, who are, I don't know whether they're influential in South America, but they're influential in Europe and on the left. And we felt that philosophically that has to be countered, because it's a regression to move back to Hegelianism.
But maybe the new Hegelians don't have much to do, or they're not so related to the physics of the 17th or 18th century. Maybe they are more accurate to the physics from the 21st century.
No, they're not. They don't know anything about it.
And how do you?
I mean, Hegel wasn't even able to read Newton properly.
But maybe
his own stuff on it is just the most awful nonsense.
But
And
maybe, but maybe his awful nonsense, they aren't understandable from the people of their time. But with the progress in science in general, from there to now, it could be some better.
the problem is one of basic approach. Is whether you learn from experiment and practice, or whether you think you can deduce things from ideal principles.
There'll be necessary a difference between those, or maybe there
is a very big difference. Yes, I mean, for example,
okay,
he berates Newton for not deducing the inverse square law of gravitation from first principles. Okay, and Hegel says that Kepler's law of orbits could implicitly implies that cross-sectional areas being swept vary with the radius of the orbit. Well, fair enough, but he's saying, oh, you could have deduced the law of gravitation from that. But if he'd read Newton, he'd see that Newton showed that Kepler's law of orbits holds whether gravitational force is inversely proportional to distance, inversely proportional to the square of distance, inversely proportional to the cube of distance. You'll still have Kepler's law of orbits. And only observation can settle which it is. And Newton does it by observing the periods of the satellites of Jupiter and shows that only an inverse square law fits. Now, the problem that is that Hegel is emphasizing the idea that philosophy can deduce the truth. Okay? Newton is saying, no, we have to use observation to discover which of different possible don't make hypotheses, says Newton, by which he means don't hold to a set of fixed ideas of what must be true. Check against observation. Now, if you then read Mao, where do correct ideas come from? And on contradiction, he is essentially defending a Newtonian view of how you obtain knowledge against the neo-Hegelian de Boronist current that was present in the Communist International in 1936. So Mao's on contradiction is a polemic against the neo-Hegelians and emphasizing the need for concrete analysis rather than deducing everything from first principles.
Your position is that from concrete analysis.
You can't obtain truth from first principles. You have to obtain truth from concrete analysis.
Mm-hmm. One thing that the point of the observation, the concrete observation of the phenomenon, is always related to the coordinate origin, to the coordinate system, the point of view of the phenomenon. It is different to see the phenomenon of gravitation, of gravity, from the Earth, the point of view inside the surface of the Earth, and from abroad, over from the space. There are different observations in one point of another. I think that's basic physics, and I don't know if you agree of that.
The issue is, how do you determine what mathematical form does the law of gravity take?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it's speculated that Aristarchus had some kind of theory of gravity, but We don't know whether he thought gravitational force was inversely proportional to distance, inversely to the cube of the distance. Who knows? We've lost the works of Aristarchus. But point is that Newton could see that there are multiple possibilities. And you don't know which one is true until you compare it with the facts.
But maybe all of them are true in different situations of the history. Different. No.
No. There is no support for the idea that there wasn't an inverse square law of gravity at some other point. I mean, there is some support for the idea that the low acceleration limit of it is not exactly inverse proportional to the square of the distance. That there's another term in it, and that is from observations of the orbits of stars in the outer parts of galaxies. So you get Milgram's theory, which is a modified Newtonian theory. But that is again coming from observation. You're saying the observations show that the hypothesis that Newton found to be true in the solar system may not be true at very large distances.
Okay, that's correct. These are different scales of observation.
Yeah. But you, again, this doesn't defend Hegel. It says that you have to have more observations to advance.
But maybe Hegel told the same thing in other words.
No, he didn't.
I am.
Read his doctoral dissertation on planetary orbits, and you'll see he doesn't.
I'm not sure. I just have to read more, maybe. But I could be I think it could be the idea of different scale observations in Hegel.
That is a 20th century concept. That's a post-Einstein concept.
Yes, I know that, but
it's relevant.
Okay. We maybe in another in another meeting we discuss more of this thing. There could be another questions from the guests here.
What are the differences between Lange and Kantorowicz? Well, I'm having to go back to my memory of reading translations of Lange's books on planning written in the 1950s, which I read superficially as a second-year student about 1972. And my impression from my memory of those is that he was much closer to the Leontiev approach than the Kantorowicz approach. But I can't say that with certainty because those works of Lange are difficult to obtain nowadays. There were very few British libraries that had copies of them, and I'm going on a 50-year-old memory of what I read.
Okay, but maybe you can tell us some details about those readings.
No, I can't tell you. I can only vaguely say I've got pictures in my mind of the maths he was doing, and it looks to me now that was that was Lange style maths. Of course, Lange was something very new at that point to the remember Leontiev style maths. Remember, Lange had gone back to Poland after having been a professor in the US, where Leontiev stuff was just coming out in the late 40s. So it would be the newest stuff out. And it had a big influence on people when it came out. Had a big influence on Marxist economists. And I think what we're seeing what I recall seeing in Lange's 1950s works were the influence of Leontiev on people like him, and I think that Leontiev also influenced Rafa.
Okay. And there is another question here. Do you see any Tarot or in the private chat? Do you see any connection between Lang's economic planning proposal and
you're presumably talking about Lang's 1930s stuff. Yes, there is a you could say that the post-Deng China is influenced by that, but Langer was much more left-wing than post-Deng China. Langer proposed the expropriation of all private firms, which is not something that has happened in China. He was assuming that the very first thing a socialist government has got to do is expropriate all the private capitalists. And if they don't do that, they're not really socialist. So the allowing of the national bourgeoisie to have their own firms, which happens in China, is well to the right of Langer's position.
So the planning proposal maybe could be failure there.
No, I mean, I don't know the details of how the Chinese planning ministry interacts with firms there. What I'm talking about is the class relations. I'm saying that Langer is saying you should not allow any private ownership of factories. Whereas the Chinese Communist Party, both in the 50s and from the 80s, is based on a compromise with the national bourgeoisie, allowing them to still have factories subject to some degree of state control direction. But that is a different position from what Langer and Dickinson were advocating in the 30s.
Okay. I don't know if there are some more questions.
I was going to give you an hour, and I've given you an hour now, and I have family duties to deal with. So I'm going to, I think I'll say goodbye at this point.
Okay. So we can maybe coordinate or have
sure, yeah.
Yes, for another meeting.
Yeah.
In the future, it could. No, I don't know. It could be this month or maybe the next month. We have to talk. We have to. Yes.
It doesn't make a great deal of difference to me at the moment which month it is.
Okay. We will keep that word. We keep that idea. And
someone asked about my upcoming work. At the moment, I've got no book being written. Okay. Or rather, the only book I've got I'm working on, and I'm not working very intensively on it, is a purely computer science book.
Okay. It's nothing to do with planification.
Nothing to do with planning, no.
Okay. So we will have another meeting in the future with some luck.
Okay, yeah.
And we will tell you later, maybe this month, the day of the next meeting.
Okay.
Goodbye. Goodbye, Paul. Thanks.
Oh, someone says wait.
Wait. Taro, dinos. Yes, pero será para la próxima. Bueno, y de hecho ya se fue Javier. Javier just left. But maybe in the next meeting, Javier we will.
Okay.
Bye.
Ahí se fue.
Se quitó. Sí, es que ya justo cuando ibas a preguntar, Javier, ¿qué tal, Javier? ¿Cómo estás?
¿Qué tal? Saludos.
¿Qué tal? ¿Nos escuchan? Sí, bueno, no. Estás hablándonos de Chile, ¿no?
Ya,
¿Qué tal, Fer?
¿se fue Paul?
Sí, es que justo cuando ibas a preguntar, ella estaba diciendo que tiene que hacer, tenía deberes familiares.
Ya, sí, sí, caché. ¿Sabes lo que le quería preguntar?
A ver,
Es que, y es
sí, y
importante.
justo, dinos.
He visto a Paul muy cercano al ACP, al American Communist Party, coqueteando
Ya,
con Jackson Hinkle, con los duguinistas.
ya.
¿Has visto esa movida?
Yo
Yo
creo que Caro
quería
la ha visto.
preguntar.
Sí,
Sí,
sí, sí he visto bastante. ¿Cómo se llama? Claro, a Paul creo que le critican mucho los sectores, ¿no? Feministas, LGTBQ, pero claro, una cuestión de patriotismo socialista, ¿no? Como
No,
dicen ahí,
pero más allá de eso, independiente de algunas posturas medias conservadoras que pueda tener Paul,
ujú,
y no es donde estoy tratando de entrar, es que Paul directamente, no sé si ha observado que el ACP, esta movida de Hinkle y un grupo de personas que para mí son en realidad una impostura, más cercanos al
son
duguinismo
más
que
pro
otra
chino,
cosa.
pues, ¿no? Y pro Putin, pues, se nota
ajá,
fuerte.
O sea, sí, pero no a donde quiero llegar. A donde quiero llegar es a la matriz ideológica que está de fondo del American Communist Party, que más que marxista, si es que están siguiendo las ideas de Alexander Dugin, son antimarxistas, son anticomunistas, y todo aquel que haya leído la cuarta teoría política de Alexander Dugin está familiarizado con su anticomunismo visceral. Entonces, preguntarle a un comunista viejo, como de experiencia, como Paul Cockshott, de que qué hace
vamos a ver.
codeándose con duguinistas, es una pregunta necesaria.
Sí,
Eso era lo
sí,
que
sí,
yo
sí.
quería
Pucha,
hacer.
ajá,
Y quería preguntarle que si su cercanía con ellos o su apoyo es algo estratégico,
eso.
es una visión táctica en que apoya digamos, al bloque anti-imperialismo yanqui, o aquellos movimientos que actualmente estamos apoyando, porque me incluyo a la resistencia palestina,
Ujú,
al eje de la resistencia, si era
ujú.
una postura táctica, si es que ve algún núcleo un núcleo, alguna semilla
Ujú.
que desde el Partido Comunista Americano, con estos gallos que son realmente cristianos, algunos bastante conservadores,
Mm.
si ve algún núcleo potencial revolucionario real o simplemente hay un viejo fascismo naturalizador de la defensa de la pequeña burguesía clásico, disfrazado de una retórica marxistoide. Y quería hacerle
Claro,
esa pregunta.
lo que decía Lenin, ¿no? Socialismo pequeño burgués, al final.
Más o menos, pero quería saber si es que lo que quería saber es que si Paul conocía el trabajo de Dugin y si estaba de acuerdo con las barbaridades que Dugin decía.
No,
Eso.
Claro, creo que ahí tengo una idea, creo que puede ser estratégica, porque cuando Pedro Castillo ¿no? Llega a la presidencia, con
acá.
todos los problemas que había, él se ofreció, o sea, publicó en su Facebook, se ofreció para dar una asesoría a Pedro Castillo, tal vez pensando que como el partido que lo llevó al poder se define como marxista-leninista, habrá dicho,
Uh-huh.
bueno, puedo acá, ¿no? Puedo acá entrar. Tengo una cuestión estratégica y me pareció muy curioso, ¿no? O sea, a veces creo que hay un poco de desconocimiento sobre las cuestiones que pueden pasar en Latinoamérica, pero también como la causa palestina también, muchas veces el Frente Democrático tiene lazos con la China actual para poder llegar a acuerdos, digamos, de tregua, de paz con Israel, para que sea mediador. Ahora,
Eh,
sobre
eh,
la cuestión del ACP, sí, es curioso porque aquí hay un grupo cercano a las corrientes de Armesilla, pero que no son marxistas, son nacionalistas, que
Sí.
quieren forzar así esa cuestión, ¿no? Se hacen llamar todavía patriotas y todo eso.
Sí,
Todo.
hay una defensa de la patria, y ahí está la discusión de si patria y nación son cosas distintas, y bueno, la discusión es muy vieja, nacionalismo e internacionalismo, pero
Sí, pues.
lo que hay de fondo, y yo creo que hay dos cosas, y uno podría plantear incluso una alianza estratégica con duguinista y plantearlo así fríamente. ¿Sabes qué? Estamos en este bloque, nos traten los izquierdistas de tacticistas, de lo que sea que nos llamen, y lo planteamos como bloque. ¿Sabes qué? Vamos a defender este bloque y somos unos, como nos llamen, y punto. No es que estemos de acuerdo con sus ideas, como no estamos de acuerdo con las ideas de Hamas ni ningún islamista, simplemente que, dado la situación actual, vamos a apoyar este movimiento porque nos parece que es el que más disminuye o tiene posibilidades de que al crecer vaya disminuyendo el poderío de Estados Unidos. Y lo planteamos así, directo.
Sí, te entiendo.
Y la otra es decir, mira, ¿sabes qué? ¿Estamos de acuerdo con la idea de Alexander Dugin o estamos de acuerdo con las ideas de un islamismo radical? Lo que no es así. No. Entonces quería saber la opinión de Paul, si es que era uno, si es que había leído la cuarta teoría política de Dugin, para que viera que es un anticomunista visceral, y dos, de que si haberlo leído estaba de acuerdo con alguna de sus ideas, siendo que Dugin es un anticomunista.
¿Con cuáles sí, con cuáles no? O si no estaba de acuerdo con ninguna.
O no estaba de acuerdo con ninguna, y simplemente se plantea que esto es una alianza táctica y que nos digan y nos digan tacticistas y lo que sea, y lo planteamos así, y bien. Vamos con ellos, pero no somos ellos ni nada, y en el momento el que se considere pertinente, a pelear con ellos, pero no es el momento. No es el momento. Así que quería saber eso, solamente. Viniendo de un marxista viejo, de 72 años, del Reino Unido, o sea, de Escocia, con experiencia, que cómo lo veía él, que cuál era su postura. Si es que conocía a Dugin y si es que él veía si es que veía alguna semilla en el American Communist Party que se pudiese salvar de este chauvinismo rancio, por el cual valiera la pena
Entiendo.
no pelear con ellos en este momento. No pelear con ellos en este momento. Más adelante. Nos agarramos más adelante.
Sí es, ¿no?, una cosa táctica, o es su oportunismo, ¿no? ¿O qué, no? ¿Qué podría ser?
Claro, es que, bueno, si es que se plantea así, yo creo que de acá me imagino, por lo menos yo no soy anti-eje de la resistencia, de hecho mi postura es un apoyo firme al eje de la resistencia, aunque se me acuse de lo que se me acuse. Y defiendo esa.
Allá en Chile no sé cuánta izquierda no está con la causa palestina, yo creo que toda, ¿no?
Es que claro, no, acá un poco distinto porque tenemos una comunidad palestina muy grande y
por si acaso,
entonces...
Por si acaso aquí los chejades somos muy pocos, yo creo que allá son más.
Ya. Ahora, si tú vas y así esta pregunta en Argentina, tú cachai que en Argentina, ay, bueno,
el sionismo es fuerte en Argentina, sí.
Muy fuerte.
Muy fuerte.
Es muy fuerte.
Muy fuerte, sí.
Es muy fuerte dentro de la izquierda, y son muy anti-islámicos, anti-musulmanes, bueno, por supuesto, anti-Hezbollah, viscerales.
Hezbollah, jamás. Si quisiera viajar a un país, elegiría Chile, Argentina, porque
claro.
Sí.
Sí. Bueno, la discusión con si apoyar o no la guerra de la resistencia, Irán, Hezbollah, venimos peleando, ¿cuánto vamos ya? 1 año y medio, venimos ahí agarrándonos, y que sí, que no. Yo no estoy de acuerdo con la postura de los LEFCOM y los manifestados. Me parece que es un error llamar al derrotismo revolucionario. para Palestina, la idea
Ya,
de
Fabián.
quitarle la...
Una pregunta, señor Javier, ¿qué entiende como LEFCOM?
Lefcom. Para traducirlo al español, los izquierdistas. Y para precisarlo en dos, los consejistas y los bordiguistas, o la izquierda italiana. La izquierda italiana que viene del bordiguismo, y por el otro lado los consejistas que vienen de los holandeses. A eso le llamo Lefcom, y la postura Lefcom es para una lucha de liberación nacional es el derrotismo revolucionario, y yo he planteado que estoy en desacuerdo con eso, y voy a sostener que estoy en desacuerdo, y me parece que es un error.
¿Por qué? ¿Por qué?
Ariel te pregunta por qué.
Sí.
Me parece que es un error por dos razones. Una, aunque se me acuse de tacticista, yo creo que aquello que actualmente debilita las posibilidades de injerencia de Estados Unidos y Europa en el levante mediterráneo es algo por lo que luchar. Y dos, llamar a quitarle las armas a la resistencia palestina, o tener una postura anti-eje de la resistencia, lo que finalmente hace es condenar a la continuación de un apartheid que lleva mucho tiempo. Entonces, me parece que el debilitamiento de Israel, que ahora están tratando de salvarla por Siria, me refiero a Occidente está entrando por Siria para tratar de balancear lo que está desgastado en Israel, yo creo que es algo por lo que luchar. Creo que es necesario apoyar críticamente, por supuesto, a la resistencia palestina y al debilitamiento de Israel, y ojalá que de acá a unos 12 años, calculo, con las posibilidades de su desaparición real, o sea, plantearlo como una disolución de Israel.
Apoyar,
y con eso...
Dice Javier, a la resistencia palestina y por extensión a la resistencia anticolonial en el levante mediterráneo. Yo creo que a lo que indica Javier es que hay consejistas y borreguistas tan infantilmente izquierdistas, ¿no? Tan, se supone, hacia el
también,
¿no?
Hasta trotskistas también.
Que para ellos no tienen ninguna validez las luchas nacionales ¿no? anticoloniales.
Y lo plantean así. Que lo plantean abiertamente y no se esconden en ello, y eso se lo reconozco y está bien. Su postura es que, dado el desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas actuales, dado el desarrollo del modo de la generalización, la globalización del modo de producción capitalista, no tiene sentido ninguna lucha de liberación nacional. Y lo plantean así, y han sido sinceros en eso. Salvo algunos que, a pesar de plantearlo así, se van a meter a las protestas pro-palestinas, lo cual me parece un oportunismo putrefacto, y lo condeno firme, y eso me parece mal. Me parece mal tener la postura y estar haciendo como que no la tienes. Cuando me refiero a ir y a ponerte la camiseta de Palestina, o a ir a vitorear, no sé, viva el Frente Popular por la Liberación de Palestina, con o apoyar una fuerza, siendo que tu postura política ya está definida como que tú estás en desacuerdo con la lucha de liberación nacional que se está dando a Palestina, y toda lucha de liberación nacional que se dé actualmente. Eso me parece mal y me parece condenable, y yo lo he manifestado así.
Sí, sería bueno, ahorita de repente Ariel nos puede dar también su opinión, pero sería bueno eso discutirlo. Te invito, Javier, de repente a una reunión, si que podemos tener aquí en el Grupo de Obrero de Formación Marxista, sobre esos detallitos, esas posturas oportunistas, hasta, ¿no? Poco deshonestas desde algunos grupos, algunos sectores de la izquierda internacional, tú los ves allá en Chile, no sé si en Perú también, bueno, he escuchado, ¿no? Algunos detalles
Los
de algunos
progresistas, pues. Los sectores progresistas.
¿no?
Claro, sectores progresistas.
Pero sería bueno, porque yo como, no sé si tú sabrás, yo también soy activista por Palestina, bueno, ahora ya sabes. Y,
Bueno, y te felicito. Por favor. Hay que ponerle ahí, hay que ponerle,
Sí,
y está, viene larga, ha sido larga y va a seguir siendo larga.
va a seguir
Y va
siendo
a ser
largo.
dura.
Uh-huh.
Y está siendo muy dura y hay que ponerle el hombro.
Uh-huh.
En
Y
cuanto a protesta, ya hay que ir, hay que manifestarse.
Sí, bueno, si comparamos Perú con Chile, obviamente me imagino que Chile es mucho más, porque el peso de la colonia palestina allá, aquí somos menos de 10.000, palestinos, allá pues son medio millón. Entonces,
Sí, somos medio millón para un país de 20
claro,
millones, claro.
de 20 millones, es bastante significativo.
Sí.
Y de hecho yo comparto tu postura sobre estos detalles de los oportunismos
Qué bueno, camarada.
y escribí un artículo de opinión fundamentando lo que dices tú exactamente, ¿no? En nuestras publicaciones de boletín, del Grupo de Formación Marxista. Sería bueno que lo leas. Pero,
Ya, comparte el OB, Taro es OB, ¿no es cierto? ¿Quién es OB?
Yo soy.
Ya, Taro. Compártemela por DM para...
Una pregunta, Javier, ¿tú eres científico en Twitter?
Vale, bacán. Te va a comprar.
No soy científico. Tengo cierta formación científica, pero no soy científico.
No, en Twitter. ¿Tu cuenta es científico?
No, él no es científico, es